Good morning and welcome back to Plant Science and Technology. Exciting times in plant science technology. Once again, though, I'm going to have to ask you guys to go on there and sign up for a crop to do for your project. I know many of you have, still waiting for some. So just go onto that discussion board. It's at the bottom of the Canvas page. In other news, I've almost got midterm completed, and I'm hoping to have it posted by the end of the day. Again, that'll be completed online through Canvas, and you'll have a week to do that. Should have all of the PowerPoints are up, and let me know if you need anything else, any slide sheets or anything like that to help you study. Otherwise, we'll continue on with chapter 7 here. And it's a little bit longer of a chapter if you're following along in the book. So I've divided it into chunks. We'll continue on Monday, hopefully finish it up. And I kind of wanted to wait till we have the midterm up before I start posting the quizzes for this unit. So just bear with me there. All right, so back to chapter 7, we were just talking about how temperature affects the growth and development of plants, and how both high temperatures and low temperatures will affect that. Where you all are at in terms of low temperatures, but we're just starting to dip into the 40s. We usually say that our average final or first frost date is around October 10th. That would be tomorrow. Doesn't look like it's going to happen tomorrow for us. How have the lows been in your all's neck of the woods?
We just dipped into the 50s probably for the first time last night.
So it's starting to feel a little bit like autumn, but not quite getting there.
Starting to feel like we went from summer to winter. But
yeah.
Oh, that's just because we're not used to it. We'll be sweating at this kind of temperature in a month.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because we do seem to acclimatize a little bit ourselves, getting used to the changes in temperatures. And I don't know, but it seems like when I was a kid, it was cooler in October. October is kind of a wild card for us here in the mountains, and I'm sure it is kind of for you all too. Some nights we can get, we've had snow in October before here. So it's
Nice.
it's a mix. The big thing with cold temperature, though, is it's not necessarily just the cold temperature itself that does damage to plants, which usually we get with just cold temperature is stunting of plants, slowing of the growth, but it's actual frost. So the first killing frost in the fall is actually causing those ice crystals to rupture the cell membranes. And it's interesting too, because we think of frost as occurring at freezing temperatures, which of course 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius is freezing for water, but the microclimate plays into that as well. So it's not necessarily just the air temperature, which is what we're measuring. So if you're looking at a thermometer and saying, all right, looks like season's over, all of my annual plants are going to die or my perennials are going to go dormant, you have to kind of look at that, one, for the crop, because there are still some cool season crops that can take temperatures in the 30s and even in the upper 20s. Our the brassicas, our cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, a lot of our leafy greens can actually stand that. And in some cases, it actually improves the quality of some plants because it causes this biochemical change in the plants. So not all plants are affected negatively by frost. Those with like thicker leaves, like take kale, for example. It's got thick, ruffled leaves. The couple frosts actually will make it a little bit more tender, and it starts to convert the fiber in the leaves to more sugars. So it makes it more palatable, actually. So we can actually have frost occurring at higher than 32 degrees if the plant is in what we call a frost pocket, little microclimatic feature, or even if we have really high winds that are causing, that cold air to be just concentrated on the plant. The opposite can occur too. You have, kind of medium to higher winds can prevent frost from actually settling on the leaves too. So this last thing that we mentioned here on this slide, that frost damage can be avoided to some extent by preventing the radiant heat transfer from the leaves to this cold sky. So usually when we have that first frost, it's when it's a very clear sky and that radiant heat transfer is able to just rise up. With thermodynamics, the warm air rises and the cool air sinks. But it all depends on where that plant is, what the topography is, what the type of the plant is. So frost doesn't necessarily kill all plants, but that's usually what we refer to as the end of the growing season for our annual crops that are frost sensitive. So say goodbye to your tomatoes. Peppers, on the other hand, it's interesting because they tend to actually take a little bit of the cold, and peppers have a long growing season, so they're just now starting to produce. So one thing you could do to prevent some of that radiant heat transfer is do something like putting some row cover or plastic over top of it. I used to work at a landscaping company, and we would do this for Japanese maples. We would go through and put sheets over top of them when we were having an unseasonal frost, just to keep them looking good. So if people came in to buy them, they're still looking pretty. Fall is actually a really good time to plant perennials and to plant trees. So, all right, let's move on here on the temperature. So the low temperatures cue plant growth and development. It's, looking at slowing it down and moving the energy in our perennial plants from the top of the plant, the above ground parts, to the below ground parts. There are also quite a few plants that need some cold-induced processes in order to actually get them to, go dormant, or to get them to, in some cases, develop particular plant parts. Some of our tuberous crops, we've got Jerusalem artichokes growing here on campus, which are like a perennial sunflower that has these tuberous roots. And right now, if we went and dug them up, we're not going to have a bunch of tubers formed yet. It's after this cold induction that they really start to form these tubers and get that energy production in the roots. So one of the things that we need for some plants is a kind of seed treatment that we call stratification. And stratification is just basically a period of time where we have cool and moist conditions that will kind of prepare the seed, in some cases to continue to develop the embryo, in some cases to remove a seed coat before they're viable and able to be germinated. In some cases, cold induction can lead to flowering of plants. We refer to that as vernalization, and that's mostly for biennial plants. So things like beets or carrots, they need that cold period in order for them to actually put that energy into the root. And then they actually will start to initially kind of shift from fibers to sugars, kind of like in the kale example, which makes them better to eat, more palatable, but also causes that biochemical change in the plant, preparing it to flower the following year. So important for seed production. Also for garlic, we actually plant garlic in October, November, just to get this vernalization, which will cause it to sprout. So you have to plant it late enough to where it's going to get a period of time where it gets cool enough weather to get that vernalization, but not cold enough to prevent it from sprouting in the fall. We also have the dormancy breakage. So a good example of this is in fruit trees. The cold first causes them to develop their buds, and they have what we call a chilling requirement, and that's usually looked at in terms of chilling hours. So some people have actually tried to grow like apples, for instance, in a greenhouse. They were not able to actually break dormancy, or in some cases even initiate dormancy, because they're still being exposed to warmer temperatures, and they're not getting the chilling hours that cause those buds to develop into flower buds as well as leaf buds. So chilling requirement is another important one as well. Another thing is just this cool temperature can lead to the tolerance of cold and freezing. So even plants that are, you know, somewhat warm loving plants, they still need some cool temperatures in order to develop a tolerance to that, so that they can grow in the spring. All right. So let's talk about water for a second, how water develops the growth of plants. First and foremost, really, you know, plants need water just to stand up. It creates this whole thing called turgor pressure in the cells. Plant cells, the cell walls are rectangular, and they're held rigid due to the, you know, plasma within the cells. So water is very important for keeping the cells turgid. And as soon as water is lost through, just through transpiration and a lack of incoming water, what do we get? We get them to wilt. So another way to kind of look at how we might kind of get plants to stay bushy is to actually withhold some water during cell elongation. And this is a strategy known as drying down. And that's mostly used for ornamental plants, because it's more aesthetically pleasing for them to be, you know, bushier than it is for them to be leggy. So we also, you know, have to think about water in terms of its role in photosynthesis, and also its relation to the absorption of gases. We have too much water and a lack of transpiration. Plants are not actually able to absorb carbon dioxide and are not able to release oxygen. If we don't have, you know, enough oxygen in the root zone, then plants can't actually take up water or nutrients. So it's important to have that soil air as well. The stomatal opening, the pores on the undersides of the leaves, is regulated in part by carbon dioxide levels in the leaves. Again, that cue of that opening allows the plants to, you know, transpire and respire. So release oxygen, intake carbon dioxide, and also release some water vapor, so that the plants can continue to maintain that turgor pressure and stand up properly. Oxygen, we think of as being a byproduct of photosynthesis and something that plants release, but it's actually important in the respiration of all plant parts, not just the fact that they're, you know, creating it as a byproduct, but oxygen is an important driver in this whole process of basically releasing energy captured and stored in the leaves during photosynthesis, but also moving that energy throughout the plant. And it's this, you know, movement and the release of the energy that drives all of the biochemical reactions that we need for the growth and development of plants. So let's look at just the beginning again. looking at seed germination. So what we think of as the beginning of life for, most plants, it begins with imbibition, which is just this period of time where the seed is actually taking up water. And it's very important that if you're, seed saving at home, that you get them completely dry before you store them, because, moisture will actually reduce viability of seeds when they're exposed to it for a long period of time. But they need the right amount of moisture to actually be able to take it up and increase the biological activity, which is the second stage there within the seed, which is basically just the embryo starting to utilize the sugars that are stored in the cotyledons and in all the food storage organs in the seed. And if we look at this bean right here, below that seed coat, you can kind of see it here where they're on the far right, this picture, where it's starting to kind of dehisce and split open there. You can see the cotyledons are actually a really big portion of that seed itself. So it's basically increasing that biological activity and taking any fats, any carbohydrates that are stored in that seed and utilizing them to push the radicle out, that root growth, and then emerge the shoot from the plumule there. So it takes up water and increases biological activity, and then it bursts open and begins to grow. So that whole imbibing of water causes the cells to swell and the seed to increase in size, and they begin to respire and synthesize enzymes. Cells elongate and differentiate. The radicle and the plumule emerge, and then leaves start to photosynthesize. So in most plants, we're really looking at trying to get a lot of vigorous vegetative growth as quickly as possible. However, there are some exceptions to that rule. In some cases, we actually might want dwarf plants, mostly for the ornamental purposes. So here in this slide, we're looking at two examples of ornamentals grown where we're actually intentionally kind of delaying the vigorous vegetative growth there. So on the left, we've got a bonsai, looks like some kind of cedar. And bonsai is interesting because we're growing them. It's this Japanese technique where they're growing woody plants in shallow containers. So they take these plants out of the containers and they prune the roots in order to kind of prevent that vigorous vegetative growth to kind of look like old trees. And then here on the right, we're growing a succulent where we're actually withholding water to keep it nice and bushy, and also to growing it in a container so it fills out that container nicely without stressing the plant and is aesthetically pleasing. So again, when we're talking about vegetative growth, we're talking about vegetative parts of the plants and not the sexual parts of the plants, not the reproductive parts. So looking at those vegetative parts, we first look at the bottom, looking at the roots. So we have 4 principles of functions of roots in higher plants. They anchor the plants in the soil. They absorb water and mineral nutrients. They conduct that water into the xylem and phloem of the plant, move it around to other parts of the plants. And then roots can also be used as storage parts for particular types of plants that have things like tubers, like sweet potatoes, modified stems, and like sugar beets and carrots. And in many cases, we actually use the roots as a way to vegetatively propagate the plants, such as in root cuttings or division of the plants, which we'll talk about later on. So the root system and the shoot system are both kind of maintaining this balance where the top of the plant is growing larger, the leaf area and the subsequent water loss throughout the leaves through transpiration begins to increase. And that increase in water loss is trying to balance, trying to have some equilibrium with absorbing water from the increasing root system. And as the shoot enlarges and the root enlarges, they're going to need greater amounts of water, because water is one of the most, in most plants, the largest part of the plant. They're also going to need greater amounts of minerals. So as the plant grows, it needs more water, more fertilizer. When we look at how the shoot grows, we can look at it in terms of being determinate or indeterminate. And basically, determinate growth, we're looking at it as being a period of very vigorous vegetative growth that stops when it becomes sexually reproductive. On the other hand, indeterminate plants will continue to have shoot elongation, continue to have vegetative growth, even as reproductive parts are developed. So some examples here, in tomatoes, we have actually both indeterminate and determinate types of plants. And we also, another one we could compare it to would be beans. So we have bush beans and then pole beans, right? And then we also have like the half runners, some that are kind of intermediate there. But what we're looking at here is just bush type versus vine type. One continues to grow and continues to produce flowers and fruit, whereas the other one stops once it reaches that sexual maturity. And there's, reasons to grow both of them. In most, really large scale field production of tomatoes, they're doing mostly determinate types of growth pattern, where they're growing tons and tons of bush tomatoes that they can actually harvest with machinery. It's very important for anything that is machine harvested to have a determinate growth pattern. That way the machine can accurately harvest everything and not leave anything behind. You couldn't do that with indeterminate plants. So in this picture, we've got some greenhouse tomatoes being grown. They have to be hand-picked because, as you can see here, they're not all ripening at once. On the garden scale, you might want to grow determinate types of tomatoes if you were doing a bunch of canning, for instance. That way you go out there, you harvest all your tomatoes, and then you do all your canning. On the right here, we've got poinsettias here that have a determinate pattern. Once they start to initiate these colorful parts, the floral bracts, and then the flower buds and flowers in them, they quit growing. And that's important for their, ornamental aspects. We talked before about the different, types of growth of plants, different life cycles, annuals being, one growing season. And in terms of the life cycle of an annual, generally we're going to plant the seeds, every year. And I will say, in some cases here, we're growing in a temperate zone. We're growing tropical plants that would be perennials in their climate as annuals. So the tomato, for instance, in the tropics, in its center of origin, is a perennial. But here we grow them as annuals. So we replant the seeds every year. They go through their vegetative phase of growth. Then they're going to start to initiate flowers, develop buds for a period of growth. Then they're going to become reproductive. Then they're going to be pollinated, fertilized, and then they're all putting all of their energy into developing fruit and mature seeds until they senesce and die. And we usually think of all of these events as occurring in the confines of a growing season. So depending on what that growing season is for that plant, whether it's determinate or indeterminate. Could be as little as, 2 or 3 months, could be as long as, 5 or 6 months. All depends on the growing season of the plant. Biennials, of course, require 2 growing seasons. That does not necessarily mean 2 years, though, to complete their life cycle. So they kind of go through a period of delay where they're not growing vegetatively quite as much, and they kind of go dormant, and then they have another huge flush of vegetative growth. And many of the biennials will kind of look like this. In this case, the hollyhock here, a biennial plant, it's producing a kind of a basal rosette. And by basal, I'm talking about it's growing at the base of the plant. So they're growing all their leaves right there at the base, growing a very long, extensive root system. And then they go through vernalization through that winter, which is causing those biochemical changes. And then the next year, they will actually become quite a bit larger, have a rapid period of vegetative growth, followed by flowering, fertilization, production of fruits and seeds, and then death. Hollyhocks have been developed, though, to be perennials as well. So we have kind of 2 different things here, thinking about the ornamental world. We've got plants that are growing vegetatively at first, then producing flowers, and then they drop their seeds and then re-sow. So those can be biennials or annuals, or in some cases perennials too. So some of them will die back to their roots and regrow the next season. Others will, resprout from seeds. So in a way, that's kind of a different dormancy. It's the exposure to the chilling temperatures that triggers the hormonal changes that then the following year will lead to that stem elongation, the flowering, and the fruiting. So we think of celery, Swiss chard, beets, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. Those are all biennials. However, if we plant them really early in the spring and they can kind of go through a flush of growth, sometimes the summer will cause them to go dormant. And then they'll develop flowers later on in the fall. Usually that's not a good characteristic. That's not a type that we would want to save seeds from. Most of our annual and biennial plants will only flower and fruit once before they die, kind of a sad existence. So. Perennials, on the other hand, they can live many years. Again, they all do have some, determined life cycle. They're not going to live forever. We look at perennials as being either herbaceous or woody. And the herbaceous perennials are going to die back to the root system and then resprout, whereas the woody perennials have that secondary xylem, basically just going dormant to the buds and resprouting. So for the herbaceous perennials, shoot growth is going to resume in the spring through the development of adventitious buds at the crown of the plant. So they go through a cycle where they're going to drop their leaves. The above ground part is going to die back to the roots and then come back the next year. Many of the different tropical, subtropical, and warm temperate herbaceous perennial ornamentals, again, are grown here as annuals in temperate zones. We have that both on the crop front as well as the ornamental front. So as I mentioned, in the woody plants, they remain alive, but they're going dormant and developing buds for the next year. And they're going to grow to kind of their ultimate size. And that takes a variety of years, right? So in some cases we have short-lived perennials, and some cases we have perennials that can reach sexual maturity in the first growing season. But we're talking about like cropping perennials. I think of things like asparagus or rhubarb, strawberries, some of these food crops that we're growing. especially in the case of like asparagus, we might plant them the first year and not harvest them, even though they're developing harvestable parts of the plants. You don't harvest them the first or second year to allow them to put more energy into that root system, so that they're more able to recover from the harvest. So in those plants, especially with asparagus, because that's the vegetative part of the plant that we're harvesting, in harvesting it, we're actually doing a little bit of damage to it. So we think of the ultimate size of the plant, being programmed by its genetics, but also complemented by the environment. So we have the genotype, which is just the genetics of the plant, the DNA, what the DNA says and how it's transcribed. And then we have the phenotype, which is how the environment causes that gene set to be displayed. And a good example of that would just be a plant grows really well in moist conditions, but in dry conditions, it can't grow to that ultimate size. So we think of its, mature size as being this, but in less than optimal conditions, the phenotype doesn't reach that. The phenotype is what we actually see. And it's important to look at in a variety of crops, how the environment affects, what we're able to actually harvest. So here we're just looking at annual growth in perennial plants, and then how that can fluctuate through the years. So we have cumulative annual growth here as being, part of just, how much rainfall did we receive in the season, how much nutrients were available for that plant. So this is going to look different in different years. If you go take a look at, say, like a pine tree, for instance, they actually, you can tell the good years from the bad years in a white pine because they have these whorls of branches that go around the main trunk. And in good years, the length in between those whorls of branches are greater because of greater rainfall, for instance. So it's just the seasonal patterns in perennial growth. Another important thing to look at, especially when trying to identify plants, is how the morphology of the plant, the actual shape of the leaves, the flowers, the vegetative or reproductive parts of the plants can change from juvenility to adulthood. So in this case, they're looking at an acacia plant, a desert tree. And in this case, the juvenile leaves here are bipinnately compound leaves, whereas when it becomes mature, the adult leaves are not compound and they appear to be linear. Excuse me. In citrus plants, they're thorny when they're juvenile, but then once the plant becomes mature, they don't develop thorns anymore. We see that in a lot of perennial plants, when they're, especially the woody plants, when they're young, they're trying to protect themselves from like grazing from deer, for instance. And then once they're able to get above the height where they would be browsed upon, they no longer need to develop those, protective organs in order to protect themselves. So they change. Here's just a table here of looking at how these different growth forms change in different species of plants. And here we're looking at, for instance, in a couple of these, the first three, the growth habit there, that vine, that word plagiotropic versus orthotropic, that's just looking at how it grows vertically or horizontally. They start off growing horizontally and then they grow vertically. So just an example here of how these plants change throughout time and maturity. So we kind of mentioned already the fruit and seed production and how that occurs in different phases. So we'll kind of skip over that. The important thing here to think about is when plants are shifting from vegetative to reproductive, there are a lot of different changes that undergo in that plant and a lot of biochemical changes. For some plants, it's important for the harvestable portion of the plant to look at harvesting it before it becomes reproductive. And I think of basil. I'm a big basil lover, one of my favorite herbs. We want to try to keep it in its vegetative form if we're harvesting it for leaves to eat, the culinary purpose of the herb, right? So once it starts to flower, that biochemistry changes and the leaves kind of get this off taste. Whereas in some other forms of basil, maybe we're harvesting it for the essential oil, for instance. In that case, we want to harvest it right before it flowers. So it's developing flower buds. That's when the oils are most highly concentrated. And then if we want to harvest it for its seed, of course, we want to let those flowers develop and go to seed. So it's different for different types of plants. For the majority of our agricultural crops, they are self-inductive for flowering, which basically is just saying that they're going to develop flower buds and start to flower once they reach a certain size or a certain environmental cue that leads to that morphological maturity. And for our annual crops, one way that we look at that is by how much heat a plant has received. And we can look at that in terms of growing degree days. Or sometimes called heat units, as a way to measure the heat accumulation for many different crops. And basically as a way to try to predict when we're going to be able to harvest the crop. So corn growers use growing degree days as a lot in terms of when do we need to start busting out the equipment in order to harvest them. In growing degree days, we're just looking at the number of days that the low and high temperatures, the average temperatures are increasing. So here's just an example of changes, in this case, in the apical meristem of a chrysanthemum, of the flower being first induced and then initiated. So it's starting off kind of vegetative, and the cells are developing and dividing through mitosis, and they're going to shift to meiosis, developing the gametes, the sexual parts of the plants, which we'll talk about here later on. And then they fully develop into a flower bud before they're able to open up into the pretty flowers. Photoperiodism, which we already talked about, the difference in light and day length. We can actually alter that in order to inhibit or to promote flowering of particular types of plants. And we look at long night or long day plants, short day or short night, ways to look at them as well. And we can give a flash of light, a night break, or we can put like a blackout cloth over them to prevent that photoperiodic change. Something that we always do for things like poinsettias, for instance. Once we learned how these plants react to photoperiod, it actually caused us to be able to, alter the way that we grow some plants. For instance, in this case, we're looking at chrysanthemums for cut flowers. And we want these chrysanthemums basically to produce flowers as often as possible so we can continue to harvest them. So we'll have some, and you can kind of see in this picture, they've got this blackout cloth up over here overhead that they will close at certain times of the day to make sure that they have the proper photoperiod in order to get them to delay or promote flowers. As I mentioned, poinsettias, kind of the same deal. And I think it's important to look at where your crops are coming from. So if you're growing poinsettias as an ornamental, generally we target that as the holiday seasons, the red and green colors. And this is all kind of a ruse, really. There was a, horticulturist traveling in, the mountains of Mexico, and they found this plant growing. They saw this color and they said, hey, wouldn't that be perfect for Christmas? So they brought it back. They started to propagate it, and then they learned that it needed that particular photo period, that 12 hours of darkness and 12 hours of light, in order to get it to form the flowers. However, we want it to get to a certain size before we get that. So we alter that through the blackout cloth or through adding supplemental lighting. We mentioned the vernalization, the cold temperature treatment that, is required to induce or promote flowering in plants. Generally, vernalization temperatures range from 32 to 50 degrees, but of course that varies among species and even amongst different cultivated varieties. And in some cases, we look at that vernalization as being important for causing even some tropical plants to become dormant. So some species can actually even be vernalized as seeds. So beets and kohlrabi, we can actually expose these cold temperatures to them in order to get them to develop the proper plant parts that we're looking for. Most plants, though, have to reach a minimum size or a certain number of leaves before they can get that vernalization. It's also really important for bulbing plants, things like hyacinths, tulips, lilies. They need that cold induction in order to promote flower development in the bulb so they can grow next spring. So theoretically, we could plant bulbs any time of the year and have some success in terms of their growth. But if you plant tulips in the spring, they're not going to bloom that spring because they haven't gone through that vernalization. So generally, we plant them in late October, November, sometimes in December, to get that vernalization period to promote that flower development. And once flowering is induced, there's a change in the apical meristem to shift from vegetative to reproductive, and from meiosis to mitosis. Another important thing to look at is if we don't have the proper temperature environmental conditions to allow for floral development, the plant might actually abort the flowers. So it'll keep them in vegetative growth and until those conditions are favorable to allow the flowers to produce. So we have spikes in temperature that can cause something to remain vegetative instead of going to flowering. So let's just take a look here at the different flower parts. And this is just looking at a kind of a simple flower and a perfect flower in this case that has all the different flower parts. The flower is dependent upon pollination, of course, for fruit set. And so here we have the female part of the plant. We're looking at that as being first the stigma, which is the receptive part of the plant. That's where the pollen actually sticks to it. And then down here, we've got the ovule and the ovaries. So the pollen is being transported down here to the ovule to trigger fertilization and then develop into a fruit. It's the male parts, the anthers over here that the pollen is coming from. The petals on the outside are the showy parts, and the sepals are, again, kind of a protective part. It's kind of what we look at as the flower bud before it opens. So female part, male part. Pollen grains themselves come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. And again, while they're essential for plant reproduction, they're not necessarily always good for people that have allergies, right? So we're actually, those pollen grains, they're different sizes and shapes, can irritate humans and cause allergies. So of course, fruit, grain, and seed formation all starts with pollination. And the anther and stigma may self or cross-pollinate. If it's in the same flower, then that's self-pollination, but it could be in different flowers on the same plant, which is still self-pollination because it's the same genetics. It could be different flowers on different plants of a clone, someone that we've asexually propagated, that's still self-pollination. Or it can be in different flowers on plants of different cultivated varieties, which is cross-pollination. Big difference here is different genetics coming in. And those pollination types are going to depend on the biology of the plant as well as how it evolved. If it co-evolves with other plants and other organisms, a lot of times insects, and a lot of times it's going to be cross-pollinating. And it will actually have some kind of mechanisms within the plant that prevent self-pollination because they need a genetic diversity in order for the plants to really persist. A self-fertile or self-pollinating plant produces fruit and seed with its own pollen. So a self-sterile or cross-pollinating plant cannot set fruit and seed with its own pollen due to these incompatibility mechanisms because it needs this genetic influx. And that's usually looking at this whole thing called inbreeding depression. Sorry, it took me a while to recall that to my brain there. Inbreeding depression we see in a variety of organisms, not just in plants, but it's where if the gene pool is not broadened, it's often exposed more to different types of mutations and just other negative effects. So we think about it in animals like dogs, for instance. If they are constantly inbred, they develop things like hip dysplasia, or in some animals, mental disorders. So cross-pollination between two cultivars can be ineffective due to incompatibility in some cases. So we see that a lot with apples, for instance. Only certain varieties are able to pollinate each other. So we might plant a Golden Delicious, which tends to be a really good pollinator, in an orchard where we have a bunch of different varieties because it's able to cross-pollinate a wide variety of apples. And usually those factors inhibit the pollen tube actually elongating and reaching the ovules. So the pollen tube is kind of a reaction of the plant from the pollen grain landing on the stigma and then going down through the style to the ovules. So when we have cross-pollination, that generally occurs as a result either from insects. In some cases we have other animals that can do it, like birds and bats. In some cases maybe even snails and slugs. Or wind is the other big cross-pollinator. And looking at how these plants are pollinated are important in getting proper fruit set. For instance, in corn, they're wind pollinated. All the grasses, all the grass family plants are wind pollinated. So you have to plant them in thick enough blocks to allow for enough male pollen to land on the female parts of the plants. In some cases, plants can be pollinated through water too. Here's just a look across section of the pistil, that female part of the plant following pollination. So we have that elongated pollen tube carrying that pollen, the gamete, the male sex cell, to the female sex cell, where we get that genetic admixture, which we'll talk about in more detail next chapter. Fertilization is when that pollen grain actually reaches the ovules and we have those gametes mixing. And we can look at that in terms of time between pollination and fertilization. Most of the flowering plants occurs in 24 to 48 hours, pretty quickly. In the cone-bearing plants and the gymnosperms, no flowers or fruit is produced. Just the cones are, basically developing a larger seed. All righty, well, that's it for today. Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right, we'll expect to see that midterm opening up later today, maybe this evening. And again, I'll give you about a week to do that midterm exam.
Okay.
Hey, y'all have a great day.
Yeah, you too.